I was just like, fuck it. I'm just going to do what I want to do. I'm going to just build the world I want to build.
My name is Jenny Danielson, and I am in Stockholm with Mark Gibson.
Yes.
This is the Art Word podcast, and we only met a couple of days ago.
Yes, we met 2 days ago, I believe. Yes.
At the opening for your show.
Yeah, my new show called Gauntlet at Loyal Gallery here in Stockholm.
And then I was thinking about a theme for this session, and I came up with disaster.
Yes, disaster seemed to come up to mind for both of us, yes.
And so I was wondering, what is a disaster? How would you describe a disaster?
I would say a disaster is a sudden break in the norm where the remnants of that break are left behind. I think a disaster can create trauma. I think a disaster can be personal and it also can be shared. I wish I had the perfect little textbook definition of it from my own instances of seeing disaster or forms of disaster. That's probably the best way I can describe it from, is that you went to sleep one way and you wake up the next day and everything's changed and you have to deal with the consequences of that change.
So it's a break from the norm. So we have something that would be normality that's a starting point.
Yeah. I would say that there is something perceived to be normative or something that has lost the sense of being perceived. And until that disaster, or till that fracture, or till that break occurs, then does it make it so evident that there was even maybe some sense of normalcy. That could be, the weather. So I've lived through Hurricane Andrew in Florida and Miami, Florida. That happened in 1992, I believe. And that was I think it was a late storm for the season. It was an early storm for the season, but it came and it decimated all of South Miami and flattened everything. And just, homes that were there were then just mud. And, I think a whole group of people who at least were my age, I remember when going to high school, the stories that people would tell from their own, near death experiences, making it through a storm like that. It definitely had repercussions. And it shifted people from what they had been doing, particularly before. Yeah. And I guess I've seen it more than once in my life. Personally, I've seen something like that. But also, I guess we're talking about other forms as well.
No, but I was thinking about, so we have disaster. Do you think that disasters are unavoidable? Does that make part of life?
I think, of course, yeah, there are some levels of disaster that are completely unavoidable. Insurance companies would call them an act of God, but in other realms, we can look at certain things. And I guess there are the disasters that, where we Monday quarterback on. So I guess in America, where I'm from, one thing would be the election of Donald Trump would be something that people would consider to be what could have been an unavoidable disaster. Some people could say that it was avoided and that there were outside factors, not exactly acts of God, more like acts of other nations that allowed for that to occur. I mean, actually, I kind of think that as the Russia probe and all that stuff kind of gets further along, I think it's more and more about American victimhood than anything. So it's easier for us to say that someone else came and messed with our shit instead of us just owning up to the fact that we're fucked up. It's much easier to blame it on the Ruskies and just be Cold War Part 2 instead of saying, hey, you know what? Well, the reason why they were able to do that is because we have a bunch of long-standing wedge issues that we've not been able to get over for the last some of them for 400 years. So how do we, it's not like they actually did anything other than just highlight what we already do to ourselves,
So a disaster can be something that we can learn from. It's in a way unavoidable.
Can be.
I
mean, disasters such as a dam breaks. Yeah, you can build a better dam. Or there's the physical realm of how you can prevent a disaster. Or there's the idea of actually creating integrity within a system that can help to mitigate some of the damage created by a disaster. So some would say that the American government right now and how it's formed is able to help mitigate some of the disaster of having a president who just wants to create turmoil and flip things over. So there's certain things that he can't just do. So there has to be Congress and there has to be steps. So that's like someone or individuals built our nation in such a way to slow down possible disaster if, like, a president comes in and he loses his mind or something, or had too much lead or mercury in his diet or something,
Having lived through a disaster like a natural catastrophe, a disaster in that way, do you think there's something like a communal consciousness or like a communal idea of history?
Well,
do we share stories, or are we able to share a story in that way?
I think it's weird because I lived through 9/11. And I think that, I was in New York City when that happened, and I lived in the East Village. So I wasn't down at ground zero, but I could see the towers from where I lived. And I think about how we almost were repeating the story of our experience to ourselves on almost an everyday basis, somewhat to understand what occurred. Some point also to just share the trauma of what occurred. Who knows? I mean, I think sometimes when something like that actually occurs, what you do in real time is actually probably some indicative of some kind of other psychological state that's occurring, but you're so unaware of it. So I remember just kind of sometimes even judging myself harshly, kind of like, am I having the proper response? But I did think there was an odd communal awareness that occurred where people were like looking at each other in the face and people were trying to help each other, and like crime went down for a certain period of time in the city. And like all these things happened because like all of you were just open. A rupture occurs when a tragedy occurs, or when a devastation, happens. Surprisingly, humans just help humans, at least most that I saw. Some run, of course. But others, some really do turn on this other gene or something, and then and it kicks in, and then all of a sudden you're like there to support one another and share in the experience of it with other people. And I think this political thing that we're kind of what's happening in America, which is extremely exhausting. It's kind of this similar thing. We're still trying to figure it out. Like, we're all kind of working it out with each other is the best way I could say it.
And in order to do that, you actually have to try to talk to each other.
Yeah. So we're talking in ways that we hadn't talked before. And at least I feel that way. But that's the funny thing, is that I feel that I'm probably having the conversation, but I'm probably not having the conversation with the right people. I'm probably not having the conversation really. Am I really going out and dealing with people who have really different points of view, or like who really think that I shouldn't exist as a living thing? No, I have not been doing that on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. But I do feel that there is at least the conversation occurring between groups of people around very severe issues that our generation really kind of didn't have to own. I mean, if anything, maybe what it is that our generation, at least my generation, all of a sudden has to step up and is like, oh my God, our parents, they're screwed up. We've inherited this earth. So like, what can we do now? We're in the place of power. So I guess that is something I've become more and more aware of.
Have you seen this playing out in the arts or in the art world? Have you seen any particular shows around this theme? Or
I mean, I think that there were shows that have occurred where it's like I felt that there was a really strong push to be political that first year out, and people formed groups. Some groups I think were within the art world attempting to speak to politics and trying to be more of an activist group or activist organization. And then there are other groups that I know of that are actually more like an action group. Like they actually have a purpose and a very clear set purpose. And so they're, it's like some of them are preventative groups. So they help teachers out who maybe are ostracized by their students who are on the far right. And so they're trying to give like legal aid and counsel to those people just in case that occurs. So that is a very different animal than like someone putting on a show with other people questioning the administration. Like one has like a lifeblood that actually can continue and will affect people's lives as they're being affected by this administration. While the other is more of a quandary or more of a proposition. One sits in a place of proposition and says, well, let's think about this. Let's talk about it. Let's maybe make some people who would normally buy our work feel, questionable about it. Mm-hmm. But typically political art doesn't, sell well or anything like that. It's not
and it's always the question of who sees it.
Yeah.
Where is it actually on display?
Yeah. And that's the deal. It's like, how do you actually, put yourself out there? And so because of that, it's sort of it's like, I remember just kind of thinking about with my students and seeing how some really were already politically minded. So when this kind of event happened, this was just like, another day for them in a way. It was just more fuel for the fire perhaps, but they actually already had like an action step. They already knew what to do. Well, other students didn't. And they were like, they wanted to participate, but typically what the people would want to do is that I'm going to form something. And what they needed to understand is like, no, you need to help someone who has already formed something. They need your support. They need your help. Someone's already working on that issue and they just need you to help them do it. And maybe they would be more effective at that. And so could people turn themselves over to be supportive of other people rather than the normal, at least for most artists, like kind of this idea of an individual pursuit. And some people I think are still participating in that. Many aren't. Many just, it isn't their bag, and it doesn't make them bad people. It just means that, that's not how you communicate. That's not how you live and walk through this world.
So I've seen your paintings now,
Mm-hmm.
but I understand you start by drawing.
Yes. Basically, it kind of starts with a proposition. The first set of drawings I made for my first book, Some Monsters Loom Large, that was kind of me trying to explain to myself Manifest Destiny, and trauma from Manifest Destiny and westward expansion and how it still exists and how it's the lifeblood of America. And it's this idea of entitlement about ownership through capitalism that I think is America's kind of beating heart from the beginning. And so I sat there and I started making these drawings. Now, the language I just used to describe that, I didn't have that when I started it. It was more like I'm working something out and I'm adding characters and I'm not going to turn myself off to it. And I'm going to try to understand this through what I'm doing. And is it like channeling? I don't know. I don't think it's like channeling. I think the stuff is just in your head. And maybe for me, I don't always have the words directly off the bat to say them. And so by the end of it, I have 20 characters. I have this 350 page book. And I wanted it to be a book. I wanted it to be in duplicate. I wanted it to still hold the quality, the line, the marks of the drawing themselves, all the imperfections of the drawings themselves, and actually figure out a way to distribute those drawings. So when I think about the books, I don't really think of them as books. I don't think of them as comics. I don't think of them so much as, I think of them as a monograph. I think of them as an art object. I think of, it's an art project to actually make these books and to have them distributed. I'm using already built-in conventional means to do it. But I think it's similar to what I just was saying about the politics of others, working with others, given their system and the structure that they already provide, and then being able to use that to get your message out.
So what would you say is the difference then? Then you take your drawing and you turn that into a big painting.
So
it's a completely different experience for me as a visitor.
Yeah. I mean,
I can have the book in my lap.
Yeah, the book is the book, but the book is yours, but the book is shared. The experience of the book, and as you turn it and move the pages, as a three-dimensional object, there's a different durational experience that occurs with it. With the case of the painting, there's a one-to-one object relationship that is more of a pilgrimage object. There is only one painting. So your time with that painting is the time that you have with that painting. Everything else out of that is out of that experience of that painting. It's a secondary experience. I try to define or make the books or have such a hand in the design and making with the books and working with the designer, who had an amazing designer, a guy named Tito, who helped me design this. He understood that what I was trying to say was no, this has to feel like this is a one-up. So even the idea of silk screening the covers, it's the silk screen has imperfections. Not everyone's going to be exactly the same. Little hints, little touches, little elements that actually give it some sense of life. But the case of the paintings, it's not every drawing is a painting. So some of the drawings are tweaked into becoming a painting if I really feel that it's necessary for the narrative I want to kind of create with the show. But in general, it's like it has to be a painting. It has to have the consideration of the surface, it has a consideration of its object nature when I perform that. It can't just be like, hey, I guess I gotta make a painting. Like it has to feel like, okay, this one runs into this one, dances with this one, and that's how they hum.
Yeah. And that in itself makes an exhibition in this case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is something I had